From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Short and sweet, this afternoon we are going to begin landing on Earth. We have three very promising talks ahead of us. Leslie Overstreet, who's the curator of natural history rare books at the Smithsonian Libraries, will introduce our next speaker. Leslie?
Thanks, Mark. Actually, before I introduce our next speaker, I have been very fortuitously reminded of something that might be of interest to a number of you, and Mark has given me permission to make a very brief announcement. The Guild of Natural Science Illustrators, which was founded 50 years ago this year at the National Museum of Natural History just down the street, is celebrating its anniversary with its annual conference this year here in Washington. It will be July 15 through 21, primarily at American University, but with at least one day at the Natural History Museum. You can get more information from brochures at the back. There's a representative from the Guild here who's happy to answer questions. And you can consult their website, gnsi.org. So now I'm very happy to introduce Kay Etheridge as our next speaker. With a doctorate in zoology from the University of Florida, Kay is a professor of biology at Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. She teaches courses in biology, comparative physiology, and ecology. Her research and publications have ranged from hibernation in lizards, estivation in salamanders, and the foraging behavior of tropical bat species. Beginning at least 10 years ago, probably a bit longer, with her publication of Loathsome Beasts, reptiles, images of reptiles and amphibians in art and science, she has been a strong proponent of the expansion of STEM education to STEAM, incorporating the arts with the sciences. Her focus on the role of images in plants and animals in the history of the natural sciences led to her being a driving force in organizing and speaking at the International Conference on the 17th century naturalist and artist Maria Sibylla Merian at the University of Amsterdam last summer, which I was lucky enough to attend. Her talk today will be just as interesting, I'm sure. Art and science intertwined. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kay Etheridge.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you to the organizers of this event. It's just something I'm really enjoying very much. So to get started here, I've already changed my talk with notes from this morning, so we'll see how this works in. But some points were made that I'd like to link to my own talk, because it's thoughts I've had, and I think they'll link very nicely now that we're back on Earth. I'm going to start talking about nature images with this very sophisticated one. This is going to be biology, I'll just say. There's obviously many kinds of nature, but this is biology. So I'm going to make the argument, I'm going to talk about the purposes of these nature images, meaning biology images. What purposes can they serve, aside from being aesthetically beautiful and stimulating and inspiring? They can be decorative, they can be symbolic, they certainly can be used to influence, don't smoke in the forest and drop your cigarettes. And I'm going to concentrate on the information in images, because as a biologist, that's one way I look at images, is what information is there, and how is this information presented. And since I was a child, I've liked creepy crawlers, hence the snakes and bats and such. And I'll get back to this image later, but there's a tremendous amount of information packed into this image. There's also the perspective of the viewer, which we heard about this morning, to take into consideration. And here you have your face up close in a slice of tropical life and what's going on here. So a little bit about how nature images have changed over time, and I'm going to zip through many millennia very quickly on that, and then slow down as we get to the Renaissance. And how have these images been spread? How have they been disseminated? There's a couple of different ways. We'll talk about that. And the last thing, and the most important in a way, is why are these portrayals of nature important? And the biggest point I want to make is that they affect how we understand and how we think about the natural world. And I think there was some of this also brought into the talks this morning, but we're just looking at it on a different level now. So I'm going to use a case study on my favorite naturalist artist, Maria Sibylla Merian, and that's who I'm immersed in now because I'm writing a book on her. And so there'll be a lot of her images, and this is one of her images as well. So we're going to go back 20,000 years. No, more than that, because this is BC, right? So nature images have been around a long time, longer than this even. So clearly they're important. You don't go into a cave with a torch, with materials that you've made yourself and pigments that you've dug up from the earth, and somehow go up high and make these images of these animals unless it's important to you. Why this was important enough to do, I don't know. This is not something I work on, but it's early nature images. Moving forward many millennia, you've got frescoes in Greece, and these are somewhat naturalistic. You can tell they're dolphin and fish. I don't know what the purposes of these were. They may have been symbolic, but they're also showing what was around them. There's water all around, and there's fish, and the fish are important to their livelihood. So these images continue. This is a fairly naturalistic lion, except for the problem that if that's an adult male, he would be taller than that man on his hind legs. So here symbolism is important. This is a king, and the king can't be smaller than the lion. The king can't look afraid in front of the lion. So even though you've got a naturalistic image, it's not about the lion. It's not about what a lion looks like or what a lion does. It's about the king's power. So this is maybe decorative, I don't know. I took this photograph in the museum in Naples, but this would have been on the floor in Pompeii. And it's in pretty good shape because it was buried for a long time by Vesuvius, and when they excavated it and looked at these mosaics closely, each little piece is about the size of maybe one of your fingernails, and they portray fairly naturalistic organisms. You can easily tell that's a squid and a dogfish, and an ichthyologist could probably identify a lot of these fish to species. There's enough information there to tell you what kind of fish this was. Nature images continue on into medieval times in many forms, and in some ways less naturalistic than things that preceded them in Europe. And I just put up three kinds of books, nature books. These wouldn't have been printed books, but hand-written and hand-illustrated before the printing press. And when I show this, I ask my students if they know what kind of plant that is in that herbal. These were used for medical. Right. And what do you think, if I say Harry Potter, how fast do you think they get that? Yeah, so this mandrake, they look at the Greek and Latin and they don't get mandrake out of it, but they've read Harry Potter or seen the movies. So herbals conveyed information. And the idea would be to, if it was an illustrated herbal, would be to give you enough information that you would choose the right plant for a medicine. And some of the herbals, it's pretty hard to tell what the plant is. Bestiaries are another thing altogether. Bestiaries would have varying degrees of naturalistic representation of animals, but that wasn't the point. The point was to tell a story, to have an allegory, to have a moral, often related to the Bible, although a lot of these stories were much older than the Bible. This is a gorgeous example that's in the University of Aberdeen, and it's online. You can see images through the whole thing. So this is about 1200, And what is that animal? I can't see you guys. This light is blinding. What is that animal? There's lots of them. What are those? They're snakes, right? Okay. Snakes survive coming out of the fire. These are salamanders. So they look nothing like what we think of as a salamander, but the Latin text with this says salamander. And the salamanders are poisoning the apples and poisoning the water. So there's information here. Salamanders are poisonous and they survive fire. There's no very good information about what a salamander looks like, but the monk who illustrated this probably didn't know what a salamander was or what it looked like. So hold that image and hold the idea of fire and poison and salamanders, and we'll come back to that. Okay, so and then hunting manuals. These are beautiful, they're decorative, but there's information about how to find things you want to hunt. So these kinds of images through the medieval period, and then, if I can go forward here, in the Renaissance, the rebirth, there is a move towards more naturalism, and Leonardo da Vinci's sort of the poster child for that, and Albrecht Dürer's another one. And this is the little tuft of grass, or piece of turf, I think is the title, and it's about, I want to say it's about that big. It's a tiny painting. I've only seen it once in person. And it's got beautifully rendered, see the dandelion here? You can tell exactly what that is. And then he did animals, and this bunny, you feel like you could touch his fur, and it would be soft. And this is what he thought a rhinoceros looked like. So this is not Dürer's fault. If he had ever seen a rhinoceros, it would probably be a more naturalistic rendering, but he did not see one, at least we don't think he did, and he based this incredibly long-living image of a rhinoceros on notes from someone else, maybe sketches from someone else. I don't actually recall the whole story, but this image gets reprinted all the way up into 19th century German textbooks as being a rhinoceros. So this dissemination of images changes dramatically with the advent of the printing press. It then becomes easy to make images very quickly relative to hand copying each one. It also makes them less expensive. They're still expensive to the average person, but they're much less expensive than if they're handmade images. So images are spreading faster. They're not always spreading accurate or naturalistic information, but they're moving around faster. So here's 16th century herbal on the right, a page from one. And I wanted to also bring out the point about color. So some of the information in images is color. And Leslie and I were just talking about this at lunch. We were talking about this at lunch because later on, naturalists actually used guides as to how to describe color. But if you bought a book in these days, you usually bought it, or print, you usually bought it uncolored. To buy a colored copy would cost much, much more. And so people would color them themselves. So the books you see now in this library, in Leslie's library, that are colored, chances are pretty good they were not colored by the person who actually produced the book, but they were colored later. And that the quality of coloring, the way it's put on, whether the colors are natural or not, varies tremendously. So colored printing is not coming along for a long time after my talk. So everything you see will be hand colored. All right, so in terms of dissemination of both information and images, at the same time, you've got the printing press revolutionizing how images are made. You've got people, Europeans, traveling the globe and collecting things. Now, if you think that all of the animals on the planet are what you've read about in the Bible or seen in a bestiary, you're going to be surprised when you see an armadillo or a giraffe or a hippopotamus or a crocodile and these things that start coming back from all over the world. You're going to see a banana. Imagine a banana. And this stuff is coming back and people are collecting it. And collecting is even quite a competitive sport among the people who can afford it. So people make collection cabinets. And a cabinet can be anything literally from a small cabinet to a suite of rooms if you are a prince and can afford it. And this one is one of my favorites, in part just because the guy's name, Ole Worm. But he was a Danish physician, and this is from a book he had published about his cabinet. So they'd make the collection and then they'd publish about it. So you've got images of the collection. And you can't see it very well, but mixed in with baby stuffed polar bears and artifacts from humans like kayaks are little art objects. Like there's a little Jean Bologna statuette over there. And he also had animals alive. This is the only known image made from life of a great auk. They've been extinct for quite a while. This was his pet. And I guess he probably stuffed it when it died, but he illustrated it. He had it illustrated. As far as I know, he did not make his own illustrations. So these images, then people can see what an auk is, and they can name it, and they can think about its place in the natural world. So this brings us to other travelers. I like this guy, Pierre Ballon. He would include like fish recipes in his book. Great stuff. He was French after all. But here's his giraffe. I believe he made his own images in woodcuts. And here's his chameleon. This chameleon's going to pop up again later too. And he traveled extensively. I'm just putting him here as an example. And people who traveled brought things back, and other people collected these things. And this was a collection in Naples made by an apothecary, Ferrante Imperato, and it was visited by people from all over. So part of the grand tour of a young gentleman or a scholar would be to go and visit these collection cabinets. And then these people made images of their collections. They published these in books. There's a whole book of his collection. They brought their little dogs. But what I want to focus in on is in these collections are also books and prints. So the collection is artifacts and objects, books and prints as well. And I've been really lucky twice to teach a course at Gettysburg College to undergraduates where the students made a collection cabinet in the art gallery. And this was in 2012. I team taught it with Felicia Eltz, my colleague in Renaissance art history. And the students assembled this, and these are facsimile books. I don't want you librarians to worry that we have actual Aldrovandis lying out for everyone to fondle. And then this was the one last fall, and narwhal tusk. This is to show, we have Catesby prints, and then we have a gar to go with Catesby's gar. This was the student's idea to put these pairings together, and we've got the crocodile and the alligator skull. So the point is, these collections, it was just as important for them to have images as it was for them to have the artifacts. And then if you visited a collection, you might make an image and then share that with your friends. Or you might document your collection by publishing a book on it. So the physical object, the artifact, and the images were very much interwoven. So here's a painting by Jacopo Legozzi, who worked for the Medici, and was sort of loaned out by them, I think, to Aldrovandi when he made his encyclopedia. Now, I want you just to compare the information in these two things. I scaled it as nearly as I could to make the bird's head the same size. So let me just look at that. That's actually better. What's the difference in the information? The color's huge. Yeah, the color is enormous. But also, once you start trying, if you scale it to the bird's head, you notice the tail's not long enough in the finished plate. So sometimes you run out of space on your plate or your woodblock or your page, even if it's a folio size. Sometimes you just run out. So there's more information in the color. But if you want to print it and sell it to a lot of people, obviously you can't hand copy this at any cost-effective rate. So the printing, you lose some information, but you also can disseminate it more widely. Okay, so here's a famous Animal Encyclopedia by a Swiss, Conrad Gesner. And who's our star over here? Well, we've seen him before. That's Ballon's chameleon. It's oriented differently. He credits Ballon for this. So this information was collected, is now in an image that more people can see in this encyclopedia. And guess who's also back in this encyclopedia? Yeah, so sometimes you can tell, notice isn't he facing the opposite direction now? Yeah, so when you copy something and then it's printed, it flips. So you can sort of watch these things flip back and forth, which is fun. And it's not identical to Durer's print, but it's pretty close. There's actually a mistake in the toe position of the chameleon in this one, but only a herpetologist like me would notice. So Gesner did something really interesting. He did not just compile other people's information. He looked at mythical salamanders. Now, this is our salamander. It's not snake-like, but it's hairy, which is weird. And then he had his artists draw a European fire salamander. They're called fire salamanders, from a specimen. And just for fun, there's what they look like, little snub-nosed things, color pattern. And if you look up close at those dots on the back, those are poison glands. So the bestiary wasn't entirely wrong. You wouldn't kill an adult human with the poison from these, but this protects them against predators. They are poisonous. So what's the story with them surviving fire? Well, they hibernate in rotting logs and under the bark of logs. So the peasant brings the wood in, throws it on the fire. Salamander thaws out, goes, I am out of here. Goes, running out of the fire. And they think, they sprang from the fire. So there's some of these stories and myths have more to them than you might imagine. So, jumping forward another 100 years, this is our protagonist. Pretty pearl earrings and very ladylike, but she ends up at some point going through the jungle of Suriname in South America and making pictures of bird-eating spiders. So she was quite intrepid. But more than that, she studied the life cycles of moths and butterflies on the host plants of the moths and butterflies. And this is where I want to make the point that she changed how we viewed nature. She put plants and animals together before anybody did in a way that was ecologically relevant, not just to be decorative, but that species does eat that plant. So that's the story I want to focus on now. So she was born into a publishing and printing family, and I'll come back to them in a minute, but her father died when she was about 3, and her mother remarried this guy, Jakob Marl, who was a very good still life painter and included insects. There's a butterfly up there somewhere. But he also did portraits of tulips for people who collected tulips, and he decorated these with little insects. And as far as I can tell, he's the only tulip painter who made these tulip portraits that put in insects, and he shows them eating the plant leaves. Most people wanted their tulip portraits to be perfect, not damaged. And he trained her. And I think she was very influenced by him. But the family firm, these are her stepbrothers, and they published this encyclopedia of insects. And the interesting thing about this, so she would have grown up with this stuff in the house, probably. This is a plate that's many, many pages before this plate. So the adults are here. Many, many pages later are the caterpillars, and there's no association made between them, and there's no food plants. It's just specimens on a page, and they're categorizing them by whether the caterpillars are furry or not furry. So they're trying to understand all of this nature, but they're not putting it in any natural context. They're not putting it in an ecological context. And that's where Marion comes along. She had one person before her who looked at the life cycles of these and put the caterpillars and adults together in the pupa, and this was Johan Hodart, a Dutchman who published his book a little more than a decade before she published hers, and she read it, she knew his work, but notice no plants, and sometimes not even the full life cycle. He wasn't as successful as she was at raising them all the way through the life cycle, but still, good work, very good work. She comes along and at the age of 32 publishes what she calls her first caterpillar book, Raupen, German for caterpillar, and that's the frontispiece, and she publishes 2 more in her lifetime, plus a 3rd tropical book, which we'll get to. She studied insects we know she started when she was 13, she wrote it herself, and probably until she died at 70. So for more than 5 decades, she studied insects, more than 300 species of insects. But she's best known today for being an artist because she produced these beautiful compositions. So here we've got one that's colored, and here we've got the etching, engraving. She was taught to make prints. So in her books, all of these books, she raised all of the insects, she painted them, she engraved the plates and or etched. I need to talk to some expert about that. And she wrote the text, and she marketed them. She had a lot of control over the process, which led to an interesting output. So just to show you, in terms of information, here is Hodart and the same species by Marion. So that caterpillar eats that plant, and she has not only the pupa, but she has the eggs. And Hodart's still talking about spontaneous generation of insects in his book. He says they're born on the wind in one text. So he talks about eggs sometimes, so he's not even internally consistent, but he didn't quite believe that all of them came from eggs, and she did. She stated it very explicitly. Then if you color the image, you add a lot of information, and you add dramatic impact. So if you have a wealthy buyer and you can sell a colored copy, more power to you. Now this is the same species. Look at his caterpillar up there, her caterpillar, and this is the actual caterpillar. Now it's hard when you're rendering this to show those long, thin, light-colored bristles. That's really hard to convey, so those bristles look shorter, but other than that, it's very identifiable. Okay, so how do you make an image like this? Well, first you have to find the animal. So where is it? Different species. Where's the caterpillar? You guys have a good eye. Oh, my thing got moved. It's a little to the left of the circle. I went to the 16:9 format and I didn't adjust for that. So anyway, but you can see the caterpillar. So you've got to go and find these things. And she'd go out into gardens and she'd collect them. And this is the best stage to start. Finding eggs is next to impossible. Catching the adults, forget about it, because then you got to get them to mate and lay the eggs. So you start with the caterpillar. Then you bring it back, and she used wooden boxes, but you've got to raise it. I've looked at papers where professionals raising this species only got 25% to metamorphose to adults. And they were working on one species, and they had graduate students and undergraduates and a climate control lab. It's not easy to do. Some months she would have been having to raise 10 different species at the same time. She also, the year she published this book, she had a 1-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old daughter, and not a lot of domestic help. So, makes me tired just thinking about it. She said that she had to feed these caterpillars every day. They all had to have specific foods, and she wrote in her book that I could hardly give them enough nettles, so active they were in their feeding. These things eat more than their body weight a day in plant material. I don't know what you weigh, but for me that would be a lot of salad. So this is a lot of work, and then she has to stay up and draw them. She would sometimes stay up all night to get this changing stage so that she could illustrate it. And of course, nothing but candles and I guess little oil lamps. And she would show the whole life cycle on the plant. This animal does indeed eat fennel. So how does she make these images? What's the process? So we have her study images. They're actually in Russia, long story. But we don't have the plant images. They've been lost. We don't know how. So this is the life cycle, including some parasites of this particular species. This is she would do a painting, and then she would make the engraved plate. And I have these oriented the same. No, these are reversed. And then she might paint the plate, or she might sell it unpainted. So you can see the information transfer. The thing that's missing, of course, is the original image of the plant. And the study doesn't have as many insects. She's added, by the time she published it, she's decided to add another size of caterpillar that she didn't have originally, and she's added another type of parasite in the eggs. So a lot of information. Now, I just want to put Hodart back up there quickly so you can compare the information in his. Same species. All right, so don't want to run out of time here. In her first book, she had 50 plates. Her second book, she had 50 plates, and she had the text. And the text is amazing. It's outside the scope of this study, of this talk today, but she looked at behaviors, she looked at effects of climate, she looked at all sorts of things. about the insects. But she was a curious woman, and when she was living in Amsterdam later in life, she saw collections of tropical insects like these morpho butterflies, spectacular. There are no European insects that come close in size or color. And she said, I want to go see those, and I want to learn. She says, I don't want to just see the dead specimens. I want to learn how they live, how they grow, what came before. So at age 52, she and one of her grown daughters take a 2-month ship voyage to Suriname, Dutch Suriname. She stays on very sugar plantations and goes out into the jungle. And the details of making this book are another whole talk, but she's there 2 years, and she comes back, she makes a fabulous book. Now, to put it into context, other people went to the New World before her. This is the kind of image that was in the book. This is a woodblock print, so it's surrounded by text. Hans Sloane, whose collection founded the British Museum, was also in Jamaica before her. He was in Jamaica here. He didn't publish his book until after her book, but he made images, animals on one page, plants on another page, never the two shall meet, and this is what Marion produced. Now, in terms of size, this is a full folio sheet, so it's large. If you bought the colored edition and it's large and it's this dramatic, this is like 3D color IMAX to the average European person who's been looking at things uncolored, smaller, and no drama, no plants and animals together. So she made this book, and this is what made her famous. So I scaled these. I don't think I corrected the size exactly right, but on the left is the European plates. They're quarto, and then the folio is on the right, shown more or less to scale. Figs, pomegranates, bananas, pineapples. She tried to emphasize a lot of the exotic plants that you could eat. But let's move on. So what do you do with this information? You can do a couple of things. You can use it to classify the world. Linnaeus famously said something like, God creates, Linnaeus classifies. I'm paraphrasing, but he was not a modest man. And he published his system Natura in 1735, and the binomial system we use now is put firmly into place. But he named a lot of things based on other people's images. Not always did they have a specimen, they often had images. And if you're trying to catalog the natural world and understand it, you need to know what's out there. And Marion, among many other artists and naturalists' work, were grist for the mill of Linnaeus and his followers, and they named over 200 species of plants and animals and insects just from Marion alone. And that's one of her. So that's one way you can use the information in these images. But I argue that that was only a minor contribution by Marion. I think she changed how we portray the natural world. Because after her, people like Eleazar Alban and many others started putting animals and plants together in ways that were ecologically relevant. So here's one example. Here's another, George Edwards. And you can see here this lizard is contemplating eating this butterfly. It's harder to see. There's a tiny little ant there in front of this lizard. This lizard's name is actually named after Marion in the scientific name. Here is Mark Catesby, who came along afterwards, and his format of his book is very similar to Marion's, and here's a butterfly and a plant. But Catesby was fantastic with birds, and so here's an ivory-billed woodpecker. We wouldn't even really know what these looked like, an auks, if we didn't have these naturalist artists, because these are gone, they're extinct. So to remind you, again, let's get the reference. There's Hans Sloane's boa. Somebody engraved that for him. He didn't do the artwork. There's Marion's little boa. Now, I want to talk about scale. The talk this morning made me think, reminded me to talk about scale. Marion, every image she made of an insect, the insect is life-sized. So when you're looking at her book, not here, when you're looking at her book, you could put that species of insect up to it, and that's how big the adult would be. The caterpillars grow, obviously, but the adults, and I have a friend who's an artist who's actually done this, so we know. So that sphinx moth on the page is the size an adult sphinx moth would be. The plants, sometimes she couldn't get them to scale right, and that boa, the scale is wrong. They were not her stars. Her stars were the insects. So you wouldn't see a boa that size next to a caterpillar, but at least not an adult one. So she messed about with the scale to get it onto a plate, but she's trying to convey a lot of information, the life cycle of the insect, the snake, a lot of information in one plate. And here's Mark Catesby artfully draping his little bead snake because he'd seen Marion's work and he thought, that's great, it's a great way to go. And his pages were the same size. They were large, and he hand-colored his first editions, or at least most of them, I think. Now, drama and spectacle, that came out this morning too. So what is more dramatic than a caiman tossing an egg-eating snake that's trying to eat its egg while also protecting a little hatching caiman? This is maternal care in a crocodilian. They're one of the few reptiles that actually do defend their young, and she's documented this in quite a dramatic and Baroque way, but these things do happen in nature. So the drama, I think, is just as important. So you've got the ecological composition with animals and plants that occur together, but then you've got drama. You're drawing in your viewer. Your viewer is seeing this tree frog as eyeing the spider for lunch. It's seeing this nasty-looking viper rearing up in a most improbably anatomical way, about to go after this poor little salamander. And then you've got drama. So this is my favorite plate in Marion's Suriname volume. You've got 3 species of spider, you've got army ants, you've got leafcutter ants, you've got a roach, you've got a dying hummingbird and its eggs, and you've got a guava tree, which she says the leafcutter ants can defoliate overnight down to something like a broom handle, and they can. I've been in Costa Rica and seen it happen. She shows the army ants attacking this roach. She shows this spider snacking on an ant while multitasking and guarding its egg sac, and this bridge of army ant bodies, which actually happens. This is a screenshot from YouTube of army ants making a body with their bridge with their bodies. So there's a lot going on in this image, a lot of drama, a lot of ecology, a lot of food chains, a lot of action. Her images, like other people's images, get appropriated and end up in catalogs. This is a children's encyclopedia. This is what you want your kids looking at night. This is one that actually, this series was owned by Darwin. So you've got spiders eating birds, copied from that. This is 170 years after Marion published, and it's still going on, and now the mate's coming in to defend it. And all of this leads us to people like John James Audubon. And so today, you can turn on the Discovery Channel or Animal Planet, or you can look at an Audubon print, and of course things are interacting, and of course there are these interactions. But Marion was the first. I'm not saying somebody else wouldn't have come along and done it, but she was the first to put these kinds of things into her images. And that's all. I want to thank a lot of people, though, especially people like Leslie and their libraries. Oh my goodness, I couldn't do it without them. And some funding, and that's all I have to say.
Hello, I'm Niki Saylor. I'm head of the archive at the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce Tom Keegan. He's the director of Digital Scholarship and Publishing Studio at the University of Iowa Libraries. Tom is in charge of a team of 11 who collaborate with faculty and students on designing, creating, circulating, and archiving of their digital scholarship. This involves not only overseeing the university's digital library, institutional repository, and the crowdsourcing platform DIY History. Tom and his team are heavily involved in helping instructors thread digital scholarship into university and community curricula. In fact, Tom has long applied digital methods in his own teaching in the departments of rhetoric and English. So as a folklorist archivist, I'm delighted that his talk is titled Strong in Their Lowliness, Everyday People, Everyday Illustration. It focuses on how everyday people, students, soldiers, fanzine artists, create illustrations as a way to explore their place in the world. Tom has a PhD in English literature from the University of Iowa, and he did his dissertation on pubs in James Joyce's work. And as I understand it, Tom resituated Irish pubs, a token symbol of paternalistic Irish drunkenness, this is in quotes, as the site for Joyce's development of a philosophy of being. And so read this way, pubs illustrate ways humans come to understand their place in the world through objects, practices, and later as part of a public entity. So yes, Tom and I have a shared affinity for traditional culture and how people make meaning of their lives, how they express themselves, and how they situate themselves within a community. He and I also have Iowa in common. He occupies the job that I left before arriving at the library 5 years ago. So I've watched with pride and admiration as Tom has taken the digital scholarship program there to new heights. He's absorbed the campus digital humanities studio, doubling the size of the staff. He's developed the DIY history crowdsourcing platform into this awesome public engagement tool that boasts more than 80,000 pages transcribed. And he provides digital humanities teaching and support for more than 70 faculty and their students. So Tom possesses a rare mix of confidence, curiosity, intellectual heft, and seemingly boundless interpersonal finesse that help make, I heard a laugh, that helps make program growth like that possible. So in preparing for this introduction, of course, I went Googling, and I came across his Rate My Professor site, or his entry. And this is a site where people can, students can comment on their experiences with the professor or of course. And so for the record, he has earned above a 4.0, above a 4.0, and a chili pepper. One of the comments seemed particularly suitable to point up to what we're about to experience today. A student wrote that Tom is a, quote, awesome guy to listen to, love his rants, unquote. As an aside, rants were mentioned in multiple entries, and I've been witness to a few of them myself. They are rapid fire, they are witty, they are performative, and they're a kick to behold. The student went on to write, quote, he really makes you wonder about the things the world has to offer. Indeed, and you are in for a treat. Please welcome Tom Keegan.
It is hard. I'm not sure I can follow my own introduction. All right, is there a pointer up here, or was there? Oh, the thing in front of me? Is that what you, okay. So thank you very much. I want to say thank you to the Library of Congress, and thank you very much to Stephanie Stillo for putting this together and giving me this opportunity. It's a total delight to be here, made even more so by the kind of homecoming that I get to experience with Niki, who had the job I have now previously. I'm not sure I'm due all that praise, either from her or my students, but I will take it. And I'm glad that Niki began with teaching, because a lot of my talk is going to be about what we do with the stuff that we're doing in my department. So I want to talk a little bit about what you're going to see here. All these slides come from the holdings of the University of Iowa libraries, in particular the John Martin Rare Book Room and the UI Special Collections. But to get them here requires a particular degree of labor that I would be remiss if I didn't point that out. So just as we're talking about the process by which some of these things are drawn, I think it's important too to acknowledge, as a librarian who's connected to the digital endeavor, that nothing you're going to see here didn't first come out of the vault, go through the hands of conservators and preservationists, move into digitization, which takes place at our library in preservation and conservation, then get handled by library information technology, the catalogers, till we finally move it into the Iowa Digital Library or DIY history. So it takes a lot of people to get that done, and I think sometimes it's, when we have nice high-res photos and they're visually captivating, I think sometimes we miss, intentionally, because it would be weird if you were looking at an image that seemed very difficult in its manifestation, but I think I kind of want to just start by acknowledging that. And we are fortunate at Iowa, as Niki pointed out, to have a kind of growing digital presence and operation. A lot of that starts with, for here, I want to talk about, the first thing I'll talk about with respect to that is stuff that comes out of the John Martin Rare Book Room. That stuff is the most germane to, I think, the broad topic of this symposium, even though I'm going to diverge, I think, kind of wildly, well, relatively wildly, after these next few slides. The John Martin Rare Book Room houses over 6,500 original works, and these are, in that rare book room, it's kind of like the special collections of our health sciences library. It's situated on the west half of campus by the hospital. And it includes things like what you see here in the back of this, or the background of this slide. Giovanni Alfonso Borelli's engravings from De Motu Animalium, 1680 to 1681. And the volume is designed to showcase humans and animals in various positions of muscle exertion with an eye to physics rather than anatomy. And so what we're seeing in these illustrations is the extension of the Enlightenment's desire to classify and define and to understand humanity through representation and scale, which that's not new news. We've been hearing about that throughout the presentations. So we've been digitizing stuff like this. I'll show you a few other examples. What you have here is an illustration from George Bartich's 1583 work, Optha Modulia das ist Augendienst. And it has 92 woodcuts, one here, and they were executed, they're believed to have been executed by Hans Hemmerwall after Bartich's own drawings. You can see here that, I think you can see in the shadows, that there are superimposed flaps. So this is close to, we're talking a 16th century pop-up book about the anatomy and operation of the eye. I also, so this is remarkable, I also want to point out that despite or in addition to its scientific merits, Bartich was into and a believer in things like magic, astrology, and witchcraft. And I'm not trying to knock him. I'm also not like advocating for the belief in magic. But I want to point out that when we're talking about the sciences, we're talking about a kind of broad and varied terrain, which is constantly changing. My wife is a classics professor, and she wanted me to make sure that everyone was aware that the word science is derived from the Greek and Latin word for knowing. And so when we're talking about science, we're talking about forms of knowing, and I think that will come across throughout a number of the slides. Here's another example of stuff that's in the John Martin Rare Book Room. This is these are two plates from Gaspar Schott's Physica Curiosa in 1697, which itself is not an original scholarly work so much as a collection of commonly held beliefs or thoughts about monsters, physical abnormalities, and bizarre animals. And so again, I see this as a kind of, it's located in the Rare Book Room. It's an illustration, though, of this evolving imagination with respect to zoology and things that are taking place in the world, complete with satyrs and centaurs. One more example, or two more examples here. We also have these two plates. The one on the left is André de Beauregard's 1751. It comes from a work, Orthopedics, or the Art of Preventing and Correcting in Children Deformities of the Body. And you also have, on the right, Bernhard Siegfried Albinis's Tables of the Skeleton and Muscles of the Human Body. And in the case of the left, most of the book, most of Beauregard's work is interested in this volume, is interested in preventing and correcting poor body posture and other defects caused by improper habits during children's formative years. As you can, I think, see, she's balancing a book on her head in that one. On the right, you have it's the engravings by Jan Wanderlaar, a depiction of the human skeleton, complete with a natural and Renaissance stylization, for which I believe he was criticized for including that kind of stuff. In any case, so this is as professional as it gets from here on out. And so I wanted to point this out, though, that across all of these, whatever their scientific merit, there is this ongoing interest in defining and categorizing and uncovering an understanding of our place in the world. And I think that's imaginative in nature. So that being said, the title of my talk is Strong in Their Lowliness, Everyday People, Everyday Illustration. And my illustrations don't look like this, so I thought we would get to some that come closer to that reality. Okay. So Niki mentioned DIY history, and I want to talk a little bit about that. It began about 6 years ago as an attempt by Special Collections, working with a version of my department that Niki was running then, to get the public to transcribe Civil War letters and diaries. The idea being that this stuff is manuscript, it's not text searchable. How do you get, you don't get a librarian to do that. No one is like, oh, you can definitely pay me a salary to sit down and transcribe thousands of pages of Civil War. I mean, that'd be cool if that were a job, but that's not where the money's going in the library. So these things were digitized and made public, and over the years, we've expanded the scope of that process. So now beyond Civil War letters and diaries, we have things like, this is a World War II letter, but most recently, I think our newest collection is the Hevelin fanzines collection. So these are, I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the talk, but we're talking about 10,000 plus zines that, from the 1930s to the present day. And so we've been digitizing these things and making them public. And the public, as Niki said, has transcribed over 80,000 pages, for which we are incredibly grateful. And we think of it now less as a transcription platform than we do a public engagement platform. So how do we get the public interacting with, exploring the content of these collections? Because otherwise, if we had not digitized these things and made them public, they're sitting in the vault, and we're hoping that, that the subject guides are sufficient to seduce you into the reading room. And that's not always the case. This letter I think there's some unique things in here. So this letter is from August 14th, 1942, and it is from Laura Davis to her husband, Lloyd, about 2 months after he was drafted. And I don't know if you can read the cursive. I know that's going out of fashion. Good night, laddie. Off to the post office, so you will have a letter arriving on schedule. And then at the bottom, you'll see the stick figures, which I'm counting as an illustration, and it says, my place here, ready? To which the larger figure says, yes, honey. In the response, good laddie. And I know you're thinking like, oh, that's amusing, but that's not scientific illustration, and that's doodling. And I'm willing to agree at this moment in the presentation that that's the case, though I plan to bring you over to my side by the end. What I want to point out is that these doodles, or what I want to try and argue here is that these doodles are part of a long process of the science of human communication and understanding, in a process that, amongst all the other things that we've seen and will see, also includes the marginal and the mundane. But before I inflict that on you, I want to talk about this kind of stuff. 2 years ago, 2 years ago this month, for Women's History Month, we made public we dumped into DIY History 3,000 pages of manuscript material that had been digitized, but nothing was really going on with them. And this material is undergraduate and graduate thesis material from the 1880s and 90s, predominantly about science and predominantly written by women at what was then called the State University of Iowa, which is now University of Iowa. So this stuff was just sitting there, and I said, well, we got to make this public. This is too cool. I think this is important. So, you know, we shared this, and I was writing some blog posts about it, and we were putting it on social media. And I had the occasion to talk to a faculty member from a different institution. So Iowa faculty, to my mind, are not guilty of this. But I spoke to a faculty member about this collection, and he said, "Well, that's sure. What's the scientific merit? The sell-by date's passed on that." You know, the Mosses of Iowa City and Vicinity, a thesis by Annette Slaughterbeck in 1888 is no longer scientifically, useful. And fine, that's the kind of, I think librarians like those kinds of softball snide comments. It's like, we're not preserving it because I think someone's gonna mine it for scientific data about moss. This is something that, we do this because it's an artifact that illustrates what students at the institution were doing, what women were doing in science at our particular institution at a time when we're talking about STEM or STEAM. Here's a vivid example, I think, of that kind of work and labor, and that itself as a historical artifact is worth preserving. It's captivating past that because of how these things are constructed, the process by which students were constructing these things. So I want to just, let's see. I want to show you this. The title for the talk comes from her thesis, her undergraduate thesis. And the quote that begins it, "Strong in their lowliness," is taken by her from John Ruskin, the famous Victorian art critic. Volume 5 of his Modern Painters, the section "Leaves Motionless." Okay, so she starts quoting Ruskin. And she writes, strong in their lowliness, that part's from Ruskin, and this is her. The humble little plants, passed every day in thoughtlessness and indifference, fill an important place in the category of nature. Carelessly scattered in waste spots, in lonely, unvisited haunts, clinging to the rocky slopes or lingering by the water's edge, slowly and unconsciously they fulfill the mission entrusted to their care. Peacemakers they are, rounding the sharp edges of the rocks, filling cracks and crevices, following in the wake of rain and decay and their painful traces. And then she quotes Ruskin again, covering with strange and tender honor the scarred disgrace of ruin, laying their quiet finger on the trembling stones to teach them rest. So that's cool, right? Jesus Christ. It's like, my dissertation reads like that garbage Niki quoted, you know, the paternalistic token of Irish drunkenness. That line of Ruskin's, strong in their loneliness, I think that's a totally beautiful line, and it clearly Annette Slaughterbeck thought so too, and I think in that idea of acknowledging the lowliest flora and its role in shaping the larger world is equally beautiful and wonderful. I think it is also wonderful to watch and to observe on these pages the mind of this undergraduate Bachelor of Science candidate weave together prose inspired by an art critic with illustrations derived from hundreds of years of scientific observation. I don't care about these things for their scientific content any more than I care about the scientific content of Renaissance-era draftsmen and engravers capturing the human imagination, one zoological bestiary at a time. That's not the point. The point is I'm interested in the process. There's a care and personality in these illustrations, and regardless of the scientific contribution they may make today, they continue to have merit in their ability to help us see ourselves, and in particular help students see themselves in the past. A student looking at this today might well recognize in their own mediocre talents, or good talents, their own abilities in these illustrations. In doing so, they see themselves in a form of seeing in these illustrations. And that is why we preserve and share outdated scientific work by undergraduate women working in the sciences at the edge of the 19th century, and why I want my students to see themselves as part of a much longer story about human inquiry and endeavor. Okay, and I just have a few more examples from this. This is Anne B. Jewett's 1890 thesis called The Sunflower as a Type of Flowering Plants. And it includes this lovely watercoloring and in this nice poem which reads, "And as the sunflower in some barren field lights up the waste with cheerful golden glow." She also has detailed cross-section drawings of parenchyma cells, and on the right you'll see the spiral arrangement of leaves on the stem. And so students here are seeing this kind of studious, hand-drawn, attentive engagement with the sciences. And I think that should, we hope, resonate with them. You can see it as well in Nellie Peary's The Fertilizing Cell, its form and behavior in these drawings, and in the curious observations of Minna P. Humphrey's The Slime Molds of Eastern Iowa. Okay, you had to do your work on something. And so these are not throwaway records of amateur scientists. These are part of a much longer imagination about human endeavor and a glimpse into the everyday work. These are not famous people. Annette Slaughterbeck goes on to get a degree in temperance science and is a German and science teacher at a high school in Illinois later in life. So these things are valuable. I think they're part of the historical record in the conversation about illustration. But they're very germane to those opening slides. So I want to kind of push the definition or weaken the definition or bring lower the definition of scientific illustration. So I went looking for other things. And that brought me to other letters and diaries. So I wanted to find these strongly mundane forms. And we have an example here. This is an August 13th, 1918 letter from Walter Fox to his wife Bess. And it details that U-shaped, W-shaped thing is a detail of his barracks at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. And so I was looking at this and I said, okay, well, why, the doodle got me thinking, why does Fox doodle this? And I think in part he does it because words fail at different moments when we're constructing these things. He's trying to give his wife a picture of his surroundings. He's trying to document his lived experience, and working within the economy of space that is a letter, he uses illustrations to convey that reality. I'll show you another one. This was another unexpected one. This is an illustration from Jackson Harrison Allspaugh's 1865 diary, in which he captures Old Tom, Company H's pack mule through Georgia. Allspaugh was a member of the 31st Ohio Infantry Regiment in the Civil War and participated in Sherman's March to the Sea, which, if you're familiar with the line ascribed to Sherman about 40 acres and a mule for freed slaves, that this takes on another kind of historical resonance. But it's not a history lecture so much as just how do pictures kind of arrest the imagination and draw us into those conversations. Here's another one that, again, has deeper context, but when I was digging through DIY history, this is what I saw first, and I thought, a picture, this is good, I need more slides. This, though, was found in this comes from Thomas Clark Durant's Miscellaneous Correspondence of 1872 to 1899, and I didn't, off the top of my head, know who Thomas Clark Durant is. Some of you may. He was kind of a railroad tycoon. Okay, he was vice president of the Union Pacific Railroad. He was friends with Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln gets him the deal to begin the first transcontinental railroad. He is also, he was a cotton smuggler during the Civil War. He was involved in the Credit Mobilier scandal. He manipulated the stock market. He was not a particularly charismatic, well, maybe he was very charismatic, but not an ethical person, which I suppose if you're a railroad person, you're probably not. But what is great about this is directions to himself on how to unlock his safe. And which is probably, if you're him, you probably want to make sure you know how. So what he's written here is, to unlock the safe, screw the knob on thus, and insert the key as far into the keyhole as possible and turn to the left. The letter U on knob must stand upright to insert or withdraw the key. And again, while that's not groundbreaking scientific illustration, it's interesting to see how everyday people are using illustrations to kind of convey meaning and method in their daily lives. This is from some correspondence from 1880. From the Bean family letters, in which two brothers are discussing how best to put a roof on a barn. So the letter reads, "It may be best to carry up the octagonal gable thus, as to pitch, but am not as yet satisfied without the drawings, which would really be the best way. The dotted lines are for a uniform pitch of roof, and the other is a peaked pitch, so as to have the ridge come out, even with the sides of the building." And again, not a remarkable thing, and I'm no architect, but I won't say that that's not a scientific illustration. I want to show. Okay, so again, now we're back to doodles. These are here, well, as you can see, we have a collection of smiley faces, frowny faces, and other faces, which to me are precursors of one of the most substantial technological innovations of the 21st century and the lingua franca of our times, the emoji. And so I think these stand in similarly as examples of people using art to fill the gaps when words will not or cannot do. These, in particular, are letters from the First and Second World Wars, in which men and women try to bring themselves as close as they can to one another. In the first letter on the left, Laura Davis, who was from one of those earlier slides, writes to her husband, "Tell me what to write or how to write, if you wish I would write differently. I want the letters to help and to be good, so that you are glad when they come." Smiley face, not frowny face. Yeah, right? That is, I have written here, that is wonderfully mundane poignancy, right? There is, in that sentiment. There is John Graham's letter of December 7th, 1942, and this is at the, up on the top left there, where he's writing to his wife about the antics of his company in 1942. Makes it kind of tough on the image of a sergeant's stripes, but no one seems to care. And that idea that you'd let the image stand in for the person, I think is quite elegant. You'll also see, in talking about public engagement, those two images at the bottom are from Daphne Reynolds to her husband Conger Reynolds in 1918. And the one you'll see the one on the bottom right. The one on the bottom right, well, I'll tell you how that's defined by a transcriber here in a minute. The one on the bottom left is a crying face. And I don't know if you can see it, the tears are labeled tears. In case I don't know what else would be conveyed there, but she made sure that he got the message. But the one on the bottom right is a letter to Conger from Daphne, in which she's talking about how difficult, he has to appreciate how difficult it is for her to have recently given up candy and ice cream, and every time she passes the shop, how tough that is. And so she writes, "Do pat me on the back a little, dearest." And then there's that kind of, that face, which a transcriber, and this is the beautiful part about DIY history and how the public reads these images, a transcriber put in brackets, "smug face," which I love. I was like, okay, if you think so, okay, that says a lot. It says something about the translator. But again, in these letters, I think that it's interesting to see everyday art and the science of human presence in these difficult spaces or places where words fail us. Another example along these lines. This is a letter from George Davis to his brother Lloyd on June 1st, 1944. And this is towards the end of the letter. George has already signed off at this point, but he's got a postscript. And he signs in this postscript, he says, "Still get to draw like we did when we went to school." And there's this animal. "It is funny when I'm working in the field, there are a dozen things I want to tell you, but when I start to write, I don't know nothing." And I think that just beneath those off-the-cuff sentiments lurks kind of real emotion. I mean, it's hard not to freight those, when you read them in context, it's hard not to freight the doodles with a meaning past their seeming lowliness. These are examples from, so we're looking at people writing to soldiers. These are examples of soldiers writing back home, and these come from the Civil War, World War, and up to World War II. And in them, we won't go through all of them because I'm conscious of time here. Men are detailing their battlefields, camps, their movements in foreign countries, flight formations is in the top left there, and on the left, plans to fix up Aunt Maud's garden in Wyandotte. So in the instance of the left here, the garden, you have Burton J. Smith writing to his fiancée, Willametta Turnipseed, and that is, I promise you, that is her name. And this is like a super poignant story. He dies, sadly, on the day she writes him, which I hate to do after laughter. It's like, her name's Turnipseed, oh, he passed away. But he dies in a plane crash. But throughout the war, we have all these really remarkable letters between them. But in this one, just to give you a sense, so here he is, that's him, that flight formation is him. But this garden is him as well. And in the letter, he says, he has this bit about the garden. He says, "As you can see, my mind is wandering, making plans again." But just prior to that, he's writing about what's happening at the time. And he says, he said, let's see, where are we? "I am still on the flight line. The hurricane is expected about 2 p.m. We will soon be taking off. Motors are roaring. Everything that can fly is going. About 4 a.m., all those ships on which only one motor of the two would run limped off to a safer place." And amidst all of that, this is in the same letter, amidst all this, he's sketching plans for a garden, his aunt's garden, which I think, again, if we're talking about science and illustration, I find that a telling illustration of human consciousness and how we think about things and what preoccupies us and how we communicate our way of being in the world. So we looked at letters and diaries. I also started looking at notebooks and cookbooks, and so as another kind of lowly form of illustration. And so this slide is a doodle by James Van Allen, who was a physicist and former professor at the University of Iowa, who was instrumental in studying the radiation belts that circle the Earth and prevent us from dying. And they bear his name, the Van Allen radiation belts. So we have Van Allen's very extensive collection of his papers, and among them we have notebooks of his, which we have digitized and the public has transcribed. I should point out that the doodle is not actually of the belts. It is a Swedish pen holder that is carefully documented and measured in one of his journals. You can see he has a 4-inch scale at the bottom, and he has labeled the holes. But I just think this interesting illustration of the scientific mind. And we're going to come back to him, but I want to show you this cookbook first. So we have another collection called the Zathmary Culinary Collection, which has a number of cookbooks in it stretching back to the 17th century. And a 17th century cookbook, in some instances, reads like a survival guide more than a recipe book. But this one is fascinating to me. This is from the Willis family recipe books of 1833 to 1861. And here's the writer, is grappling with the phenomenon of negative after images. Okay, so when you stare at something and you close your eyes and you see the inverse of that image, color escape. So this is what's written in the cookbook. The fluctuation of colors at the border of patterns when the ground and the pattern are of complementary colors, so that if a red wafer is laid on a white paper in a strong light and looked at for some time and then removed, the eye, now looking on the paper, receives the white light or the part of the eye when the red image was before. but the red portion of that white light produces less than its proper effect. Consequently, there appears a greenish spot where the red wafer was. And so the hashing out of this scientific experiment goes on, and then there's this suggestion of an amusing experiment. A very amusing illustration of the property of the complementary colors may thus be made on a paper about twice the size of a sheet of notepaper. Draw a rough figure, paint every part with bright colors complementary to what the colors ought to be, as green cheeks, white of the eye, black a black cap, a red ribbon green, a green gown red, and so on, a very black frame pattern all around. Then lay this on the floor in a strong light. Look for some time, then look up to the ceiling, and in a minute you will see a spectral picture with all the colors right. This requires a little practice. In some eyes, see it better than other. I think the closing line there, with some wry candor, young eyes best. So this is great. I love these instructions that are, in these weird, unanticipated illustrations creeping into these mundane spaces. And these are Van Allen. Now, Van Allen, no one's calling him an amateur scientist. Okay, he's a pre-NASA. He's involved in the U.S.'s first satellite. He is instrumental, as I said, in the space exploration in the U.S. and globally. But these are doodles, from his notebooks. And he's got things in here. I don't want to walk through all the illustrations, but he's sketching crude magnometers, square wave frequency calculations, radio antenna, and a bunch of other technical concerns. When we show these things to students, or why we'd want to show them to the public, is to help them understand the ad hoc, immediate, and improvisational character of a process. That the work is not always so clearly defined. It is a muddle, and you work things through in shorthand. So I think it's important to be able to share that kind of material. And since we're talking about space, I wanted to go to just the last section. I want to talk about the Haviland fanzines, which may be more jarring because these look a bit more coherent, but they're also further afield. The James L. Rusty Haviland collection at the University of Iowa contains about over 10,000 science fiction, as I said, fantasy and horror zines, collected by Rusty Haviland. He was this uber fan and took everything, and we were happy to have it from him. Recently, the University of Iowa Libraries made the decision to make about 6,000 pages of this material available. So we digitized these things and turned them out to the public. Many of them are deeply, if we're talking about lowly objects, these are deeply ephemeral materials. They are mimeographed, in most cases stapled, and published in small quantities. Like some, for instance, this is a cover from Fan Slants, this is the back cover, I should say, of Fan Slants, had a 3-issue run. This is from September 1943, and it features, I don't know if you can tell, I think you can, as a ghost reading people stories, clearly shocked at what it is discovering in those morbid pages. But I love that title, People Stories, because my argument would be that that's what zines are. They are people stories. That's what the fantastical, the imaginary, the horrific, we create these things in an effort to better understand ourselves. And I also dig that it's got a memento mori, this, the death trope that it's also artistically present in history, I think, or influenced by what's come before. But so these are a couple examples of zines that are, showing us where the cultural imagination is at the time and how we're understanding our place in the world. These are also people who saw, and Lovecraft is an absolute touchstone for this fan community, and they saw him as an illustrator. And so I just wanted to include, these are illustrations by H.P. Lovecraft. And this is a letter they ran. This comes from Acolyte, Volume 1, Issue 4, in which the summer of 1943, titled Lovecraft as Illustrator, and it's a reprint from a letter Lovecraft wrote in 1934. I want to share just a part of this letter with you because it's interesting to hear Lovecraft, a horror writer, the father and part of weird fiction, describe what he thinks he is as an illustrator. I feel tremendously and undeservedly flattered by your kindly mention of the crude and casual sketch in my letter to Rimmel. I've always wished I could draw, but have no natural aptitude for it, so that despite infinite pains, my best efforts in that direction are rather ludicrous and pathetic. Odd too, for my grandmother, great aunt, and late elder aunt were all accomplished artists, while my father's sketchbooks attest his very passable skill with the pencil. It makes me green with envy when I see certain naturally gifted persons effortlessly translate a visual impression to paper, When I try the same thing, the result is an awkward mess of forced pen scratches. I have always envied authors who can illustrate their own tales, pulling into visibility exactly what they have in mind, instead of depending on the routine work, often careless, uncomprehending, and unsympathetic of magazine illustrators. But I have scarcely hoped to be able to produce anything suitable myself. I'm under no illusions as to the inaptitude of my unschooled pictorial blunderings. And so, despite how harsh he is on himself, this is a community that's interested in illustration, interested in trying to communicate what's inside of them and what they're thinking about. And it's not so far afield, I think, from where we started. If you think of Albanus's centaur or satyrs, or where the cultural, historical imagination lies with respect to what counts as knowing the world, I have you literally covered, because here again, we have two covers. This one on the left from Venus, Volume 1, Issue 1 from 1944, featuring a centaur, and on the right, La Zombie, Volume 5, Issue 4, January 1943, again with these ideas and these figures in different contexts, but still part of that longer history. It's hard not to see in this history, for instance, on the left, R.A. Hoffman's cover for Acolyte, Volume 1, Issue 4, summer of 1943, the kind of attention to cellular microbial detail that we saw earlier in something like one of Nellie Peary's looking at the fertilizing cell, or the anatomical observations in Neil Helmer Fromm's cover for Canadian Fandom at the top. In 1947, or the influence of biological study in Clark Ashton Smith's Alien Creature in the pages of Acolyte 2, Issue 4, 1944 at the bottom. These zines are awash in the fantastical, but perhaps no more so than any of the illustrators or scientists will see or have seen today and coming up tomorrow. All of them, it seems to me, are addressing our place in the world, whether real or surreal, which today are continually confused, I think. But I want to end on this idea of sight. We saw that Bartsch in Hemmerwall's eye with the flaps. And I thought this was too good not to share with you. This is a story by, I assume it's a pen name, Jean St. Jean, called The Discerning Eye, from the March-April 1942 issue of The Comet. In this brief story, Paul Dunlop, an amateur chemist, prone to verbomania, a sad disease which afflicts one with a propensity for big words, falls victim to a horrible accident that allows him supernatural sight. He can see the table, quote, composed of multitudinous, tiny, active organisms. He comes to see the earth, quote, was a great seething mass. The impact it drives him mad, which is where these stories often go. But so his wife finds him covered in this chemical, and she's asked him, can he see? And he shouts to her, see, the magic word, see, not view, observe, look on, but see. In the excitement of the moment, he forgot large words. He began another deep chuckle submerged in the depth of his chest, and as it reached his peak, he realized the tremendous force he possessed, the various possibilities of his state of being. No more days at the office. No, love that's where you go. First thing, no more odious hypocrisy, no more fetid miasma of pretension. He could see in. His sight was an eruption, a scientific hyperbole, but a truth. He had no walls to contain his sight, no bonds to bind him. He could look through anything or anyone, and his peculiarity was permanent. This he could feel. Nothing could maintain his sight. What a power he had. And when they led him to the asylum, this is the next sentence, and he protested, as always, to their imbecilic fallacy. The gates closed with a final click on the man who could look through the strongest walls, the stoutest barrier, but he could only look. Now, despite that dark ending for Paul, I truly appreciate the crazed emphasis on sight here. Perhaps if we, like Paul, look more closely into the, to quote Annette again, waste spots and lonely, unvisited haunts, into the, dare I say, archives and collections that contain these lowliest forms of illustration, we will come to discover new ways of looking at things, and new ways of recognizing ourselves and our world, from the elegant engravings to the most fleeting doodles, all of them revealing a kind of strength in our earthly presence. Thank you.
Hello, I am Abby Potter. I'm the acting chief of the National Digital Initiatives here at the Library of Congress, also known as the Library of Congress Labs. And I have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker and her talk, which is called Storytelling with Science. Eleanor Lutz is a PhD candidate at the University of Washington studying biology, specifically studying how mosquitoes learn and remember new experiences. Lutz also runs the incredible science illustration blog, Tabletop Whale. Here you can see her work, which has also been published in National Geographic, Scientific American, and the Gates Foundation. Her work adds a sense of wonder and playfulness to science by finding inspiration in historical science illustrations and art movements, while also ensuring they're accurate by working directly with scientists and doctors. Lutz also includes digital design techniques such as animation and programming in her work. Today, Lutz will speak to us about finding the balance between artistic styling and scientific convention, celebrating the complexity of scientific research, and combining digital design technology with traditional art styles. Eleanor?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Abby, for the introduction. It's really nice to be here today. So, I make science illustrations like this one. This one shows you how grasshoppers breathe using this very complicated network of air tubes instead of having any lungs or blood vessels like we use. And it's not the most efficient system, but it works because insects are pretty small and don't use a lot of oxygen. And I make a lot of animated infographics like this one, but I've also done a few static illustrations for science articles and magazines. And today I want to talk to you about some of the things I personally have learned through making these infographics. So first I'll talk a little about how I got into science illustration in the first place. And then I'd like to talk about some of the things that I think are the main challenges for me when I try to make these projects and how I try to address those challenges while working on something. So I got into making science illustrations more from the science side than from an art background. I got my bachelor's degree in molecular and developmental biology, broadly studying how people and animals grow and change throughout their lives. So I've always been really interested in these really intricate processes that are happening around us and in our own bodies every day. So processes like this one where lifting a cup of coffee or just your arm, where these trillions of tiny molecules and fibers and molecular machinery are really working together to make your movements look seamless and easy. Or how everyone sitting here today developed into a functioning human from just a tiny cluster of cells. So here in this graphic, you start at the top right as a fertilized egg, and it animates the process of embryo development all the way to birth at the center of the diagram. And I really think it's kind of incredible that we all went through this very complicated developmental process before we were even born. And so for me, design is really a way for me to share these really awesome science stories. And I like to try and share them in a way that uses color or movement and really tries to uncouple the technical jargon from what's actually happening and what the science actually means. And when I'm making these infographics, there are really two challenges that I think are the most difficult for me, and the two questions, really, that I try to think about when I work on a project. So the first challenge for me is really to decide what information belongs in a graphic. I think we have such a huge library of scientific information, and it's very difficult to pick out an individual story that makes sense. And in particular, to pick out a story in a way that's respectful to the science and also to the audience. So I think a good infographic really lets you pay attention to what's really important, and it does that by removing everything else that's less relevant. And the second challenge that I try to really think about logically is picking an art style that really complements the science. I want to find a way of connecting the art and the science in a way where both of them are kind of talking together in a conversation, and the graphics is actually an integrated part of the science story. Okay, so between these two challenges or overall goals, I want to talk about the information first. And I want to convince you that this really is like a big challenge to distill this information, and that this is like a very big constraint in making these science illustrations. Because there are a lot of other constraints in making an infographic. Obviously, there's things like the deadline or the size of what you're allowed to work on. But there's also things like vocabulary, the amount of text. And of all these different constraints in a project, I still think that deciding what to remove in the first place is really the most difficult. And to give you a more concrete example, here's two examples of some really complicated science figures that I personally really love. On the left is a food network by David Levine. I'm not sure if you can see that. But it's a food network based, it's intended to talk about the codfish, which is near the center of the diagram. And its purpose is to show you just the huge variety of animals and organisms that are interacting with each other in a natural food network. And we usually see like a simplified food network with only a couple different species, maybe the most common or important predator-prey relationships. But in the real world, there's actually a lot more going on. And this one on the right, it's a diagram of all the neurons in a tiny nematode worm called C. elegans. The worm's only about 1 millimeter long, and it has more or less 300 neurons. And this kind of network diagram of neurons is called a connectome. And the C. elegans worm is special because it's the only animal where all of these nodes have been mapped in this way. And in this map, each of these colors tells you a little bit about what each of the nodes stands for. So the purple on the edges of the diagram are the muscles. The yellow are the motor neurons, which are telling the muscles what to do. The blue are the neurons that are gathering sensory information from the environment. They're detecting things like touch or smell. And the orange are interneurons, which connect all of these other things and make up this very complicated diagram that helps this tiny worm move throughout its environment and make decisions. Okay, I'm going to show you just one more picture of a complicated science diagram. And bear with me, because it's my favorite one. It's a molecular diagram. It's about all the things that happen inside your body when you digest some food and turn it into molecular energy. And I love this because I studied molecular biology. I really like the idea that when you zoom down far enough into our own bodies, all of us look like this really crazy, complicated network of molecules and chemicals and interactions. And all of these are, different things happen when you eat a protein versus a sugar, and these are all represented in this diagram. I actually didn't even include the whole thing, it's cropped. Okay, but as much as I love this figure, it's too much information. It's just, nobody can look at this and process it all at once. I don't think that's possible. So a useful infographic to me is never an accurate, complete representation of all of the science. It has to be curated in some way to be useful. So the first thing I try to do when I plan an infographic is really think about my particular audience for that project and what they really need. And most people don't need all of this, and it's actually more helpful to get rid of the things you don't need. And depending on the audience, that can mean very different things. So here's my attempt at turning that molecular diagram into something a little more reasonable. This is a story for medical students. So it's part of a series of 20 different posters I made in collaboration with a company called Nerdcore Medical. And the point of these posters was to work as kind of a large, interesting picture that people could put up on their walls, but also use as a study guide for medical licensing exams. So that's a very specific audience with a very detailed and clear set of goals. And because the audience is so specific, I haven't actually removed too much information. What I've done here is gone through and picked out several of the chemical pathways, like the TCA cycle, that you would probably need to know for a medical licensing exam. And I've removed a lot of the pathways that you probably wouldn't need to know or are less important or less known. But in the pathways that I did include, I didn't actually remove a whole lot of the information inside each pathway. So I still have things like the names of all the molecules, the intermediate chemicals, like even things like how much molecular energy each step would take. And these are all things I would probably have removed if this was for a more general audience, because I think this is still a really complicated graphic that's hard to understand. But since the intended audience here was really medical students, I needed to include all this information because they needed to know it, and that was really the deciding factor in how much information to include. So I have a second example here where I'll go into a little more detail about how exactly I made the design and how I try to think about the audience in concrete ways throughout the process of making an infographic. This is a poster from the same project. It's about 60 different kinds of viruses that affect humans and which you might need to know about that are common diseases or are important in various other ways. And the poster is arranged where you probably can't read it, but each of those little gray boxes is one specific type of virus, and the box contains some kind of interesting facts that you probably need to know. And these specific facts include things like, well, the symptoms if you get the virus, how you might be able to treat it. And also, I use some icons to provide a little more information that might also be useful for medical students, which is my audience. So I have a little vaccine icon on some of these virus boxes to show the ones where we actually do have a vaccine for that virus. A lot of them don't. And I also have an insect icon. Actually not sure if there's one here that shows it, but I have an insect icon to show which viruses can be spread by mosquitoes or ticks or other arthropods. So I'll show you some sketches from the process of making this infographic. And really the major point or the major problem that I had when first starting out was deciding how to arrange these 60 different types of viruses on one diagram. Because if you have 60 things, there are a lot of different ways to arrange them. You could arrange them by phylogeny, like a family tree of viruses. You could arrange them by order of how dangerous they are to people, or group them by how you would treat the virus infection, or into general categories of biology. And so when I have a kind of open-ended question like that, I try to think of a couple of these solutions and then pick the one that really makes the most sense for my particular audience. So in my case, the audience is medical students. They don't actually really need to know how viruses are related to each other. This isn't a project meant for evolutionary biologists. So that's probably not a great way to do it. And metrics like how dangerous a virus is or how to treat it, those things can really depend on a lot of external factors. So I also don't think that's a great way to arrange something like that. And what I ended up doing is to divide up these 60 viruses based on 3 very broad major groupings. So on the bottom of the figure, in pink here, those are all of the viruses that infect humans using RNA. And in the top, those are 2 different types of viruses that use DNA. And these are very broad topics. And I could have made this a family tree. I could have put a lot more information here. But really, for the purposes of my audience, medical students studying for an exam, they really don't need that information. And it's enough to just have these 3 major types of biological, how viruses work. And sometimes I think it's actually better to have just stop at just enough information instead of including everything you possibly could. And in the end, I play with the color and shapes a little bit. But the main point of the infographic and the majority of the layout that I work on is really based on these questions that I try to ask myself about, does the audience actually need this information? Like, what do they absolutely need to know? Because I have to include that. And then everything else, like really asking myself, is this necessary? And this project was a series of 20 posters. I'm not going to go through all of them. But throughout the year and a half that I spent working on the project, these were the consistent questions I tried to ask myself about what the audience was really looking for. And I'm not a medical student, so this kind of thought process was pretty heavily reliant on medical textbooks, other kinds of study guides for these exams, and I also worked with Dr. Irwin Matthews, who commissioned the project and who's a medical doctor who worked with me throughout the process. And I think this research was important because all of these posters are meant for a very, very specific audience with a very specific set of needs. Like, the people who are looking at this are actually trying to use it to gain some information. It's not a project that's meant for fun, or, I mean, it was fun, but that's not really what the end goal of the project is. So that's one very specific type of infographic that I've designed. But I also work on projects meant for the general public, and I think that's a very different process. So I want to talk about an example of a project I worked on for a more broad audience. Okay. So this is an infographic I worked on with Wired about how different kinds of plants have evolved to survive in California, where there are a lot of wildfires. It's for the general public, and the full infographic has 6 different examples of plants that have evolved unique adaptations to fire. And I picked these 6 plants because each of them are very well known scientifically, and they all provide some kind of unique example. They all have a different adaptation to fire. So there's the giant sequoia, the first one, which has very thick fire-resistant bark, and the fireweed, very aptly named, which grows very well after a forest fire has swept through a region and left this very open, burned landscape. They grow very well in those disturbed areas. And the California black oak, which has a very extensive root system, and even if a fire burns most of the top of the tree, it can regrow from the tree stump left behind using its root structure. And all of these 6 examples really help illustrate a very different aspect of fire adaptation. And in this infographic, I'm limiting the number of examples to just 6 instead of the 60 viruses I showed you earlier. And that's because a general audience is much more diverse. And I want to go into a lot of detail with each one of these examples so that I can take a group of people that are from very different backgrounds and really help them understand the science in the same way. And when I'm curating an infographic with fewer examples, I try to really make sure each one has a purpose. So for the example I showed you with 60 viruses, a lot of them are very similar to each other, but a medical student would probably still need to know both of them. For here, I didn't want to include things that were redundant because I only have 6 examples. So I went through and really tried to pick out the plants that contributed something unique to the infographic. Each one tells you something a little bit different about fire and plants. Okay. So I've been talking a lot about how information editing is a constraint or like a limitation of making infographics. But I think it's really also an opportunity to try some cool design techniques and do something a little more creative. So I made this particular infographic with actual paper and fire, which was a lot of fun, and it's something I wouldn't have been able to do if this was meant for a more specialist audience. So because it's meant for the general public, I didn't need to include a lot of very specific scientific details like the number of seeds each flower produces or where exactly to find the plant, its life cycle, all of these things that would be important for a more specialist audience. So this doesn't have to be a plant identification guide, which means I can have a lot more fun with how I present the information and removing things like color and those details. So I set the plant sculptures actually on fire and videotaped them, and afterwards I turned them into an animated loop in Photoshop. I accept that using paper and fire isn't a conventional way to make plant illustrations, but I wanted to do this because I think it really emphasized to me what was the point of the graphic, which was really how closely tied these plants are to wildfire, how they really, some of them really require fire in order to complete their life cycle, and how this is just such an ingrained part of the science for these plants. Okay, so the end result is something where the visuals are a little less conventional, but I think it still includes a good amount of information. And when I design infographics for a less specialist audience, I need to curate the information a little bit more and really boil down the infographic to the very important examples, because I usually include fewer examples. But this information editing isn't just a constraint for design. It can actually open up possibilities for new ways of showing information. So to recap, when I make an infographic, I really try to think about the audience, what they actually need from the project, and to try and meet them there with something that provides the right amount of information. And to some extent, the process of doing that and thinking about the audience really influences the design choices I can make. And that brings me to the graphics half of my talk. I talked about the information first, because I don't think you can have a good infographic if your information is bad. But once you have the data, then you get to work on the really fun project of finding an art style that really can be combined with the science and really complement what I'm trying to say. And this is a very open-ended challenge, because design can do a lot of things. It can make you feel astonished or upset, or it can make a difficult topic feel easy, or at least more interesting. So my specific goal for each project is always a little bit different. But overall, for all of my projects, I really try to make sure I have some specific reason for using that design style. So it might not always work all the time, but if I can have a logical reason for using that design, I'm pretty happy at the end. So I want to go back to this molecular pathodiagram as an example. And what really strikes me the most about this image is the really tiny scale at which everything is happening. It's really just so complicated and tiny that, of course, we can't see any of this happening with our own eyes. So when I turned this into an infographic, I really wanted to highlight this kind of impossible scale, because that's how I really felt about the science, or that was what I thought was the most awesome thing about this project. And this concept of extreme size really reminds me of old constellation charts, like this page from the Celestial Atlas. Molecules and stars are both just so different in size from humans that we have a really hard time picturing them and understanding them. And even though the idea of molecules is actually a pretty recent development, people have been looking at the stars for thousands of years and inventing these patterns and ways of looking at size to try and make sense of something that's so different in size from ourselves. So when I made this infographic, I decided to illustrate all of the chemicals kind of in the style of stars in a constellation, because that's a way of understanding size that has been part of our history for a really long time. And I really like this kind of visual allegory, I suppose you would call it. And I try to include something like that in a lot of my projects, and to pick an art style that has something, at least thematically, to do with the science. And what I really want to do with these visual design experiments is highlight what I think of as the warm human side of science. I think in a lot of media or movies, scientists are often portrayed as these extremely serious people in white lab coats, and they're running around their very high-tech lab frantically with a clipboard. Probably it hasn't really been portrayed like that at this conference, but a lot of movies, I think. But I don't really think science is about the white lab coats and the high-tech equipment. I think it's really about the need to understand where we came from, or what we're made of, what might happen to us in the future. So I don't think science is a cold technical field, even though it's sometimes portrayed like that. I think it's a very warm expression of human curiosity. And I want to use art to kind of add an element of warmth or surprise to my science illustrations. So I have 3 examples left in this talk, and I want to use them to share with you a few different examples of how I've tried to do that in some of my different projects. So this first example is a series of virus trading cards. I animated them using a science software called Chimera, which was developed by the University of California, San Francisco. Each of these trading cards shows you the structure of a viral capsid, which is the protein shell that surrounds the genetic material inside of a virus and protects it. And I've included a couple human diseases like dengue and HPV, but also in the middle is the chlorella virus, which infects green algae because, of course, humans aren't the only ones that get viruses. And I decided to illustrate all of these viruses as trading cards. And to me, the excitement of finding a rare trading card is like a nostalgic feeling that a lot of people can identify with, even if they don't necessarily think viruses themselves are particularly exciting or interesting. And I was also inspired a little bit by these cigarette trading cards. So these cigarette cards, which you can see on the right, were trading cards, were fairly small and came in cigarette packs in the 1920s and earlier. And they were really included for structural support for the cigarette pack, but they came in sets of 25 to 50, and they would show you, trading like collectible images like fire trucks or flowers or actresses. And I wanted to play off this concept of having something that's not very good for you, like cigarettes or viruses, but they're still very, they have something beautiful about them, and they're very highly collectible. And I like this idea that viruses, I do think they're geometrically beautiful and fascinating from a biological standpoint, even if they're not very good for you. So my second example is this animated butterfly infographic. This project was inspired by illustrations from 19th century naturalists and illustrators, like the insect pictures on the right. And these days we have photos and 3D scanners and videos, so scientists, we don't have to draw all of our discoveries. But with this project, I wanted to think about what might a 19th century naturalist do if they had access to all of this modern art technology? What if we didn't have photography, but we still had computers and animation and Photoshop? And of course, it's just a playful thought experiment. But it was also kind of a way for me to remind myself of this very long history of natural exploration that people thousands of years ago and hundreds of years ago have been really interested and excited by the natural world in very much the same way as scientists today. And this last project I'm going to show you is an antique-style map of Mars, and it's one of my favorite projects. This isn't really an infographic, it's more of a map, like cartography project, but I'm including it here anyway because it's a project where I put a lot of thought into trying to find an art style that really worked together with the science. And for this map, it's a mix of hand-drawn and digital. The kind of 3D layer underneath is open map data from NASA, but I also printed out a topographic map of Mars and traced it in pencil to add some kind of like hand-drawn feeling. And then I added everything back together digitally. And the style for this map was inspired by 18th century atlases like this map of the world. And I love these maps from hundreds of years ago because there's still so much left to explore in the world. So you can see like all of these blank edges where the information runs out at the top or the sides. There's just still so much to explore at this time period. Antarctica, the deep seas, like mountaintops and deserts. There's a lot of mystery here on the map. And nowadays, of course, we have these very detailed satellite maps and images of Earth. So we don't really have that kind of mystery anymore on our own planet. But we still don't know very much comparatively about other planets and moons in our solar system. So I think today, really, planets like Mars are kind of the modern equivalent of this geographic frontier, this mysterious land that we still have left to explore. So in this project, I wanted to use a very similar design style to kind of tie together how we have such a long history of mapping and exploring new places, and tie it into what we're currently trying to do in exploring other planets. And I also had a second reason here for using this design style. One of my favorite things about planetary science is how scientists have decided to name different features on other planets, like mountains and craters. And the feature naming really is different depending on the planet, but for Mars, we name craters after famous scientists or artists, and for very small craters, we name them after tiny villages and towns on Earth. So to me, that was such a really fun example of how data isn't impersonal or technical. Even when we're exploring this lifeless, barren desert in outer space, we still give the features names of people we care about from history or the places that are really close to us on Earth. So my second goal here was to use this very hand-drawn personal style to try and highlight the human side of planetary exploration. And I also made a second map in the series. This one's for Venus. And the history of the exploration of Venus is actually very interesting because the majority of spacecraft that have landed here were probes sent by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And the Soviet Union was actually very successful in exploring Venus at this historical time period. So for this map, I decided to use a design style that was a little inspired by propaganda posters from the Cold War era. It uses, the big block letters, kind of 60s-inspired color scheme with the red and yellow. And here I wanted to use art to really emphasize the role politics played and the role of government in scientific exploration and how we got all of this information in the first place. So those were two very different examples of how I've tried to incorporate human values and human history into maps of planets where no one has ever really even gone. Okay. So pulling back from all of those individual projects, I want to go back to the two main challenges I talked about and that I try to address in my design work. So from the information side, I think it's really important to try and understand the audience and what they really need, and to at least try and meet them there with something that provides the right amount of information, but not so much that it's overwhelming. And to me, this is one of the biggest challenges in science communication. But even though it's a challenge, I think it's not just a limitation, it can also open possibilities for how you can communicate the science and introduce new creative ways of showing the data. And from an art perspective, I think art really can add a sense of human warmth to the science and to really make the story relatable and visceral and make you feel emotions about the science. It doesn't have to be hard and technical. And I really think it helps emphasize the idea that science is just as creative and driven by curiosity as things like art or writing and literature. And finally, I think the most powerful stories are the ones where the science and the art are really integrated so that if you changed either one or the other, it wouldn't really be the same story anymore. And I think there's a lot of value in making visualizations where the art and the science are talking back and forth in a conversation instead of being dominated by one or the other. And that's really my goal and what I try to do in my design work. So thank you for taking the time to listen to me today, and thank you very much to the Library of Congress for inviting me.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.